intelligence that can be languaged. And here's where the paradox occurs, because Mercury is the planet of language. Mercury is the planet of interchange of information through ideas and words. And Mercury has been in Pisces for a while and stays in Pisces for a while, because 3 times a year Mercury turns retrograde, which means that it covers old ground, which is what it's doing now in Pisces, where it doesn't know which way it's really going.
Exactly. Traditional astrology is filled with ideas about what planets belong in what signs. And Mercury does not belong in Pisces, at least according to astrological tradition, because Mercury is logical and data-oriented, and Pisces, the sign of feeling, is the antithesis of data. However, when planets are in places where the ancients thought they didn't belong, it doesn't mean necessarily that things are bad. It usually means things are more complex, and at the higher end of the equation, there's the possibility of embracing more. It's sort of like going to a country where you don't speak the language. You may have a great deal, you will have a great deal of difficulty understanding ordinary conversations. But because your intelligence is taken off of its usual track, you may become aware of many other things that you wouldn't notice in your own nation.
Right, and I think what's interesting here is not only is Mercury retrograde in Pisces, and as Jeff said, the sun is in Pisces because it is every time this year, but Mercury and Venus often track close to the sun, and Mars tracks close to the sun every other year. And right now, the 3 personal planets, Mercury, how we think or how we talk or how we communicate, Venus, what we like, and Mars, how we go after what we like, are all clustered close to the sun in Pisces, making this an especially Piscean pre-spring.
Yeah, and I want to come back to the idea Rick brought up earlier about emotional intelligence. Pisces is a water sign, and the water signs Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces are the signs that have to do with emotion and feeling, which is why Rick brought up this idea. Yet, an interesting thing about Pisces is that as the last sign of the zodiac, it is the least personal of the water signs. So the emotional intelligence that's available to us now is not so much about unraveling our individual and unique stories. It is about understanding collective principles of feelings. With the moon in Pisces, we can be
With
lost
the sun in
at
Pisces.
sea. I'm sorry, thank you, Rick. With the sun in Pisces, we may be lost at sea, but we can feel currents that we wouldn't otherwise be aware of. And I think one of the most important things of Pisces is compassion. That idea of being able to recognize something beyond our need to hold ourselves or to hold other people accountable. Now, on one hand, that can look sloppy and loose, but on the other hand, this is a time of year when it is appropriate to let go.
Yeah, and in some ways, the Pisces metaphor is really about the dissolution of individuality. That's what compassion is. Compassion basically says someone else that's hurting hurts me. When I have compassion, my feelings are empathic or sympathic. Sympathy and empathy are both heightened in Pisces because there's a resonance that I have with what's out there. And what's really interesting is that spaced out, dreamy, imaginative, confusing side of Pisces. Remember, Pisces is the sign that does involve all those aspects. And they're all about the dissolution of the boundaries between me and other people. And although the ego needs those boundaries to survive, the spirit, and here we come to the spiritual side of Pisces, that is heightened with so many planets in Pisces.
Yeah, absolutely. Dissolution is a Piscean theme. And that's, I mean, we're popeless at the moment. I don't know how you guys are getting along. Do you realize we have no pope? So where are you finding your guidance?
Does that mean we're popeless?
We are, yes, I said we are popeless.
We're
absolutely, at this time. There is a dissolution at the head of the Vatican. And what the hell is a sequester? Well, there's something else that nobody seems to be able to do anything about or to completely understand, and the authority and the responsibility and the accountability are not there. So both here in the U.S. on a national level with respect to economics, and globally for about, the billion or so Catholics on earth, we're rudderless and in many ways leaderless.
Right, which are both really Piscean issues, and popelessness somehow goes with hopelessness.
Or hopefulness, depending upon.
And that's the thing is that the idea of having someone at the rudder or controlling the ship is really another illusion. And I think that part of taking that illusion away gives us the opportunity, as planets move later in the month and on through the spring into Aries, it gives us the opportunity. The recoil is to take responsibility for ourselves.
Yeah, well said. And this is also part of not only a larger pattern, but the most significant astrological pattern, one that Rick and I have been talking about for a couple of years, and that's the ongoing squares or challenging right angles between powerful Pluto in authoritative Capricorn and revolutionary Uranus in independent Aries. There is a collective, longer range breakdown of structures and institutions. And, we can either feel helpless in our lives, particularly now with all of these planets in Pisces, and thrash about in the waters of our lives trying to find a ground, or let go and float. The secret of Pisces is that when we stop fighting the currents, fighting the tides, the right ones will find us.
And there's that wonderful Hopi prophecy that's been going around now for a few years that really is if you Google Hopi prophecy, you will find this image of these are times when the river is flowing fast. Do not try to hold on to what you have. Push off away from the shore and float. That is the key to survival. That's what that prophecy basically says. And it's really, that's what you're just saying, with all these planets in Pisces, this is an opportunity to let go of those things that we thought were giving us security and safety, and to rudderlessly go with the proverbial flow.
And I can certainly understand in my own life and in others' lives how difficult that is. If, the critical issue, whether it's health or job and money or relationship or family, whatever it is, we're all sort of have an ingrained need to sort of address the issues in our lives rather than passively trusting that they're going to work themselves out. Yet, with all of this Pisces mushiness in the air, with the overlapping discussions at both ends of the room and the lack of sonic clarity that I'm experiencing at the moment, we have two planetary bodyguards that are probably keeping us from going off the rails.
And are you referring to Saturn and Pluto?
Absolutely. Whew. These are the two toughest planets in astrology. Saturn was called the Greater Malefic, the big bad guy. Kronos, Father Time, limits, mortality, the wall hitting the boundary.
Until he met the real bad guy.
Pluto, that's right. Pluto, the mythological lord of the underworld, discovered in the depths of the Great Depression in the early days of rising fascism in Europe and in Japan. Pluto is harmoniously aligned with Saturn on and off this year, but right on the 8th of this month. And what that's like is having the lifeguards who are sort of making sure that even if you drift out to sea a little bit too far, that there is a sort of an invisible kind of protection, an early warning signal or a sense of guidance that's operant even when we think or feel like we're lost.
And when Saturn and
Yes,
Pluto.
that's what we said.
Saturn in Scorpio, Pluto in Capricorn. This is a slow-moving aspect that was exact for the first time last December, is again now exact this week in March, and will be exact a third and final time late summer, early fall. And what's interesting is all these planets that are moving through Pisces. You see, Saturn is in watery Scorpio, which means that all these planets moving through Pisces, one by one, as they come through the early mid-degrees of Pisces, are forming harmonious sextiles with Pluto and harmonious trines with Saturn, as Saturn and Pluto themselves are getting along. So what happens is that the taskmaster, the final judgment day of Saturn saying, this is the end, it's the final exam, if you will, is actually taking us to a place that has long-lasting potential with real power for deep transformative change. And these apparently spaced out planets in Pisces that are pulling symbolism and information off the internet rather than the internet, they are working really soundly and solidly with Saturn and Pluto to give us something of lasting use, lasting value.
Yeah, and what's interesting is another astrological indicator of orientation are the positions of the moon's nodes. These two horseshoe-shaped objects opposite one another represent those points where the Earth's orbit around the sun are crossed by the moon's orbit around the Earth. And the south node of the moon, the dragon's tail to Hindu astrologers, represents kind of a karmic trap. And the south node of the moon is in Taurus, my sign, the sign of fat, dumb, happy, self-indulgent, comfortable, and not particularly adventurous. Well, comfort's a great thing. I'm not suggesting that you have to, torture yourself, but the north node, the point of growth or integration, is not quite half. It's about a third of the way through its 18-month stay in Scorpio. Scorpio is not about comfort. Scorpio is about necessity, and it's the emotional necessity that recognizes the value of pain. Now, there's worthless pain, and the difference between helpful pain and worthless pain depends upon where we stand with it and what we learn from it. To be in a place of some kind of chronic condition that we just accept and we're limited by, or if we don't accept, we keep complaining about it, that's pretty destructive suffering. But the suffering or the pain or the loss or the discomfort that brings things to a head and provokes a deeper self-assessment and transformation is powerful, useful, desirable, part of what Saturn, the planet of necessity in Scorpio, is demanding, and part of what the North Node in Scorpio is telling us is worth doing.
Now, one of the, I think that bringing the nodes into this equation is very important, but again, what it does is it re-solidifies the importance or the use of all these planets currently in Pisces, because they are also, one by one, making harmonious trines to the North Node in Scorpio and to the South, and a sextile to the South Node in Taurus. And so some of the key dates here are Venus makes this harmonious sextile to Saturn March 6th, which is today. Mercury retrograding does it tomorrow, later today and tomorrow, because the two of them are very close to each other. The Sun did back at the beginning of the month on March 1st. And then as Mercury turns retrograde by the end of the month, March 28th, Mercury is again making this harmonious trine. And so in some ways, with all of the imagination and openness of the subconscious mind that we're experiencing with this plethora of planets in Pisces, that we're also getting the ability to ground them and to really do something solid with that.
Yeah, I think that's well put. And where we're heading is to the new moon. We have a new moon every month, and this month it's on March 11th. That'll be next Monday, only in 5 days, and it's a new moon in Pisces. Now, every new moon begins a monthly cycle. Every new moon is a joining of the sun and the moon, sort of dad and mom, to conceive a new monthly cycle. This is the one time of year when we get the new moon in Pisces. And what we are conceiving on the 11th and in the few days that follow, what we are conceiving are new dreams, new ideals.
Dreams because it's in Pisces.
Right. Pisces, the last sign of the zodiac, is very much about imagination and faith. And having a new moon in Pisces is wonderful for starting spiritual practices of one kind or another. It's wonderful for initiating any activity which becomes a source of inspiration. If it's artistic, aesthetic, creative, and carries you with it, rather than something that you're struggling with or fighting against, this March 11th new moon is a very good time to catch that wave.
Right, and there's two things or more, but at least two things about this new moon that make it so interesting. One is the fact that there are 7 Mars, Moon, Sun, Venus, Chiron, Mercury, and Neptune, 7 planets all stuffed within the sign of the sign of Pisces, that goes from the very beginning of the sign, Neptune being the first, to Mars at the last degree, so that the entirety of Pisces is covered. And so it's very important, just the density. It sounds funny to say density and Pisces in the same sentence, because Pisces is not dense because the energy is dispersed. But the density of planets in Pisces is very strong. It creates a story of its own. And secondly, the fact that starting the following day, there begins an escape of the gas from Pisces with direction into Aries, and we'll get there in just a moment.
Yeah, that's what this month is really about. It's the transition from the last sign of the zodiac, which is Pisces, that surrender, go with the flow sign, to Aries, taking I was going to say the bull by the horns, but it's really letting the ram take you by the horns and push you forward. Now, interestingly, on the new moon, Rick is quite right. We're not getting a lot of aspects or angular connections to the sun-moon conjunction.
Which is often one of the ways in which we gauge the flavor or the power of a new moon.
But we do have, just about 4 degrees away from the new moon, Venus, the goddess of love, the planet of beauty and grace, traditionally exalted or in a higher state of experience in spiritual Pisces. Venus is conjoined that new moon, and it's really about love. But it's not necessarily about personal love.
Right.
It's about universal love. And having that Venus in Pisces and the universal love that represents at the new moon is really a signal to find joy in your life. And if you can't find it, give it. Serve someone else, and it's likely to come back to you.
Well, and it gets back to that whole idea of dissolution. We all have our own stories. We all have our own heartaches. But with this new moon with Venus in Pisces, that story isn't relevant. It's like, you know what? It's just another story. I don't care. And it's not really that I don't care. It's what's really important is, what do you do with it? You turn it into compassion. You turn it into a greater love. You turn it into a love of those who need help, those who need acknowledgement or appreciation. And so there's somewhere to go with it.
Absolutely. And as Rick has already mentioned, the engine to take us somewhere is starting to kick over, because Mars, the planet of ignition, the planet of initiative, is blasting into its fiery home sign Aries for the first time in 2 years. So we're at a very interesting point to get a new moon, inspiration, and yet have that little kick in the butt that Mars in Aries represents to drive us to take action.
Yeah, it's actually a smack in the head, but I don't want to go astrological on you because Aries rules the head, and the ram moves forward head first. It's that whole ready, fire, aim, which is the Aries energy, and Mars is the planet of Aries. And so what we have is on the 11th, we have the new moon in Pisces with Mars at the very last degree, and the following day, on the 12th, early in the day, Mars moves into Aries, followed by the moon, and what happens is that they join up, they conjunct in Aries, and so we get this moon-Mars connection of Mars, assertion, aggression, direction, the moon, our feelings. And so our feelings can really be overcharged with adrenaline and energy coming off of that melted, fuzzy, magical, spiritual new moon just the previous day. And now we're ready to kick some head.
Yeah, but one of the challenges is sustaining an effort. Aries, the pioneering, fiery, spontaneous first sign of the zodiac, is not known for conservation, and it's like taking off for a race and forgetting to fuel your car.
It's the tortoise and the hare.
In a way,
it's
yes,
the hare.
Yes, and the issue is that Mars is not will. Mars is method or means. So the method or means of Mars in Aries, juiced up by the moon in Aries on the late on the 11th to 12th, is to go, go, go. But chances are that if we push too hard, too fast, we may run out of fuel quickly and sort of lose connection with the inspiration that Pisces has brought us. So let's think of this Mars going into Aries as being like first gear in a standard transmission car. It's about getting you going. But if you try to floor it without putting it into second gear and third and fourth, you're likely to break down your car, your transmission, pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I think the temptation, though, to floor it anyhow is great, not only because of the Mars-Moon conjunction itself, but later in the day, the moon moves forward and it joins up with Uranus, which is seated in Aries for a 7-year period. It moved into Aries 2 years ago on the day of the Fukushima earthquake tidal wave meltdown. That was the day that Uranus moved into Aries. And so we're pushing a second anniversary of that. And as we do, as Mars moves into Aries, even though it's 7 degrees away from Uranus, it's in the same sign. It's got its antenna up and it knows it's there. But that same day, the moon moves across Uranus, which is lightning-like and explosive and sudden. And in some ways, it sets up the energy that will begin to build later in the week as Mars reaches that point.
Yeah, and what concerns me is that when you have Pisces, which has a certain degree of vulnerability, and then you've got Mars and Uranus and Aries, which say, I have to do something, anything, that action can really be a disguised form of panicky behavior. That I think until the 20th, which is really what we're aiming at, when the sun goes into Aries and we're able to sustain initiative, be careful about panicking, of getting into those situations where you're operating as if it's not going to happen now, it'll never happen.
Yeah, I think you just hit on something really important, and I would even take it a step further to say that going into action can also be a form of denial because we have real feelings and emotions cooking, and sometimes that Aries, especially with the moon and Uranus, what it can do is it can pop the energy, and it's like lighting the dynamite that releases the tension, and the tension might not have, the tension sometimes has a purpose. and it may be a premature explosion, so to speak.
Yes, as it were.
As it were. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind, that even though we're tempted to light the fuse, that it may be a good period of time to also keep that deeper energy just kind of cooking, stirring in the pot a little bit longer, not only until the sun moves into Aries a week later, which we'll get to in just a moment, but also until Mercury finishes up its retrograde period.
That's right. Mercury, the communication planet about which we spoke in the beginning, stops dead in its tracks on the 17th of March and begins moving then.
It went retrograde.
23rd of February.
So from the 23rd of February all the way through now and through March 17th, we've been in this retrograde phase that kind of is all aiming at this transition from Pisces into Aries. And inside that, Mercury turns around and says, mind, you're released from going over the same old crap you've been over for the last 3 weeks or more. And now we're going to begin to turn around and face in the right direction forward, which Aries likes.
Yeah. But since Mercury is still in Pisces, it can mean we're just better able to articulate our delusions or to rationalize, our fantasies. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with fantasies because they can be inspiring and they can lead us to things that aren't fantasies. They can point us in a direction, like the new moon, to aspire to something that we might not be able to achieve, but might bring us in a direction towards something that is achievable and doable for us. But as we can see, maybe the common ground between Aries and Pisces is a very poor sense of timing. Neither one of those signs are about timing. They're both about full immersion. Pisces is the full immersion in a sea that we didn't create, and Aries is full immersion in ourself, in what we are doing. And while they're both dynamic, potentially, and energetic and creative, strategy is often not the strong point.
Yeah, I think that's true. That's wise.
So remember, when Mercury goes direct
on the 17th, the planet is moving very slowly. When any planet changes directions, it's barely moving. If we can match the pace of Mercury, that is, Mercury in Pisces, open-minded and imaginative, but slow, then we're much more likely to have the ideas and the activities that we have in mind turn into something useful. Yeah, and again, I think that's one of those things that that sounds good on paper, and I agree with you, but in theory and practice aren't always the same. And in theory, you're right. Mercury is now stationed, not moving, getting ready to turn direct, building momentum, going to speed up over the next few days on the 17th. That same day, the moon is in Gemini lining up with Jupiter. Jupiter kind of saying, yes, go for it, more, bigger, this is great, everything looks good. So we get this, our mind is turned around, we're now looking forward, we're eager, we're ready to go, and we have Mars only a few days away from lining up with Uranus. We're looking not only for our gas pedal, any gas pedal. And so you're right, I think that we'd still benefit from slowing down and hanging out in the past, but I think that foot is itchy and looking for gas.
I agree. And, if clearly you're just restless, go ahead and do something, but do something bold and daring, but not something that is a major risk. Because, again, all of our forces aren't lined up in a sort of a military perspective. It would be going behind the enemy lines or making an attack with a small number of soldiers who are just sort of testing the territory. But the full army of consciousness arrives on the 20th when the sun, the planet of will, the planet of life force, and the planet of consciousness moves into Aries, marking not only the beginning of the astrological year, but of course the vernal equinox here in the northern hemisphere.
That's right. And as the sun moves from Pisces to Aries, we get the feeling that the time is now. I mean, that's the blessing and the curse of the moment of creation. The illusion is that now is all there is. Because Aries, as Jeff said earlier, is not only about self, it's also about self as being all there is in this moment, no past, no future. That moment of creation contains everything. So what happens is that on the 20th, the sun moves into Aries, but the following day, or within a couple of days actually, the following day, Mars catches up with Uranus. And so, again, this is Aries, Aries, Aries. It's explosive, it's energetic. Remember, any planet lined up with Uranus becomes irrepressible, if you will. Mars is already irrepressible. In Aries, he's doubly or triply irrepressible. And so the sun is now coming in to put some consciousness or fuel behind it. And I think that this vernal equinox is the game changer.
Absolutely. I mean, it's important every year, but perhaps this year more than most. On the 21st, the day after, Venus, the planet of love, values, and pleasure, moves into Aries, reinforcing the readiness and appreciation for that which is new. You can have all this Aries stuff driving forward, but Venus in Pisces is still going to be flipping through the high school yearbook and reminiscing about the past in some Piscean sentimental way. Once Venus goes into Aries, it's almost as if another aspect of personal values and the feminine is ready to join the forces that are moving forward.
And remember when we started out, all these planets, well, these planets and all of these except for Uranus were all clustered back here in Pisces. And now there's been an escape. Mars, the Sun, and Venus have all moved on into Aries. And each of them, one by one, will line up with explosive Uranus and square just a couple days or a few days later, powerful Pluto, reminding us that the deeper issues that were set up in the last couple of years, the cultural, social, economic, personal issues of powerful one-way metamorphosis, transformations, evolution that is attached to revolutionary Uranus and evolutionary Pluto. As these planets move through early degrees of Aries and contact these points, it'll be more than just another spring.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very dramatic and very well put, Rick, in that when faster moving planets trigger the big slow moving outer planet patterns, as Rick pointed out, all these planets join electrifying Uranus and then run into stressful 90-degree squares with a provocative, potent, and controlling Pluto. The forces of change are building up. This is very earthquake energy. In an individual level,
lifequake.
Lifequake energy is a good way to put it. And interestingly, the basic notion of astrology is we can report the energy patterns. What we can do with that information is either to consciously participate in an appropriate way, which means being bold, original, stepping out, fighting for what you believe in, being fresh, being new, or we can resist the change and have it imposed upon us in other undesirable and inconvenient ways.
Right, and as we move closer and closer to the end of the month, we get first Mars, which has gone over, Mars conjuncted Uranus back on the 22nd, I think it was.
Yep, the 22nd.
On the 22nd, and then it reaches its square to Pluto on the 26th, and then over the next few days, the Sun and Venus, which are getting closer and closer and closer together, moving almost the same speed. And I don't think they actually join until the 1st of April or until...
No, the 28th of March.
The 28th,
they get
sorry.
together.
Okay.
Yeah.
They actually join, and then they're lined up with Uranus, and they square Pluto on the last day of the month. So this is incredibly powerful times.
Yeah, and I'd like to come up with some strategies or tactics for dealing with this contrast of first hitting Uranus, which says, screw the rules, I'm free, I'm radical, I'm independent.
I can do anything.
Anything. I'm not bound by the laws of anything.
Including cause and effect.
Right. But then we all run into Pluto in Capricorn a few days later.
That says, yeah, right.
Right. So what that means is if you want to drive fast, go to a racetrack where you can do it, because the consequences for breaking the rules are pretty severe.
Yeah.
Now, if you prepare for that, if you buy insurance in advance by sort of calculating what the risks are about, then you've made a conscious choice. But if we blindly chase the person, the object, the activity with the naivete of Aries, well, then old law enforcement, Lord Karma, whatever Pluto in Capricorn can impose is likely to encounter us. Of course, the positive side is if you know what you're detonating and why you are blowing it up, it can leave you with the exact hole you need to fill up with the job, the love, the life, or the idea that you're really going for.
Like a clearing of the deck, or like a forest fire burning out all the underbrush so things can grow healthy.
Right. Well put.
You know, there's another piece that's also coming in this month that is very important. We talked about the Saturn sextile to Pluto. But what's also going on this month is that Jupiter, not very comfortable in Gemini, forms quincunxes. Those are these green lines. And a quincunx is an angle or an aspect of discomfort or ill at ease. It's about making adjustments because the energy doesn't feel right. It's like, Jeff says, it's like oil and water. And what happens this month is that Jupiter makes a quincunx with Saturn on March 23rd and then with Pluto on March 29th, which creates a background energy of all of this stuff in Pisces saying it's smooth, it's okay, it's imagination, it's fantasy. All the Aries stuff saying now, blow it up, do it, go. And there's a part of us that really finds it difficult to keep one foot here and one foot there and know how to balance those energies.
Yeah, and I think the way that we tend to do it with Jupiter and Gemini is just to lie. You know, the planet of truth in the sign of I'll say whatever pops into my head could just be a denial. And yet I think a more desirable and productive expression of that is being flexible enough to be able to shift gears. I mean, don't we have moments, they might be 10 minutes apart, where first you have to be really focused and concentrated, and then 10 minutes later you get off the highway, you get out of your car, and you're in the dog park with your dog and you can wander around. And that's the good side of Jupiter in Gemini, which is to be adaptable.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think Gemini is the con artist of the zodiac. I mean, it's that Bob Dylan is a Gemini. You know, I mean, there's that ability to, you know, which is him. None of them, all of them, whatever. But there's another thing going on here also with this Jupiter forming quincunxes to Saturn and to Pluto, and that is that the planets moving into Aries are harmonizing with sextiles to Jupiter, forming their own sets of quincunxes. So we have a very complicated energy that builds later in the month that really has to do with this go for it, do it, Aries, explode, make it happen, and the restraint of Saturn, Jupiter being able to justify anything. It's a complicated energy that builds.
Yeah, and I think that Aries planets to Jupiter in Gemini is just an overdose of information. I've got an idea. I've got an idea. I've got an idea. Well, what's the use of having a dozen ideas if you can't prioritize and implement? Right, and implement any one of them. So if you're in a situation with a group or yourself where you're just overloaded with ideas, try not to keep adding ideas. Yes, it's very clever. Yes, it's wonderful that you are channeling spirit or the creative, intuitive side of yourself, but digesting and applying information requires editing, and that's what Saturn and Pluto are for. Then we get to one of the wilder lunations of the year. Lunations are new moons, full moons, and the full moon in Libra, which is on March 27th, every year, not on the same date, but when the moon in accommodating Libra, how are you? Are you happy? Are we peaceful? Are we at ease with one another? Opposes the sun, and I don't give a crap about anyone else, Aries. And yet this particular full moon is a bit more than the usual. Should I act independently or should I compromise? This one really raises the stakes in the game of relationships.
And even without knowing astrology enough to interpret the meaning of each planet and each sign and each aspect, just compare in your mind the number of patterns in this full moon compared to the Pisces new moon when there was almost no lines at all inside that circle. The lines are like noise. They're like another instrument in the orchestra playing. And this full moon, regardless of the specific information that we'll talk about a little more in a moment, has a lot of instruments playing different tunes.
Yeah, and there's one in the string section. That's the moon in Libra, and the brass section is really loaded with all of these planets in brassy Aries.
Yeah, and Aries really is brassy. I mean, the idea of Mars, martial, marching bands, that whole idea of that of brass in music is a Mars sound.
Yeah, so not only do we have the usual opposition of a full moon, which can be crisis-oriented or illuminating, but as Rick pointed out, we've got 3 planets here on the Aries side, so that increases the voice of, let me do it my way, and yet Pluto is making right angles, indicated by the red lines, to this particular full moon. So I think even though we as individuals certainly have the creative capacity to turn this into breakthroughs and discoveries of desirable types, we're going to see some big noise on the collective level.
I agree.
Hopefully, some of it will be some Nobel Prize winning discovery, but a lot of it, or at least some of it's likely to be a bit more dangerous.
Yeah, and I think here, because Pluto is involved as squares, Pluto in Capricorn, remember Pluto is about nihilism, meaning that which has reached the top begins to deconstruct so that it can fall apart, so it can be reconstructed from the base up. And we're seeing that a bit in government and economics already. We're seeing signs of that, even infrastructure like bridges and things of that sort. But what happens here is not only is Pluto involved in this square to the moon and the sun and sun-Venus, to the full moon, but it's exactly square to Mars. And remember, Mars is Aries' key planet. The full moon is opposite the sun in Aries. Mars, Aries' key or ruling planet, is exactly square Pluto, and Mars and Pluto are tough planets. They are the co-rulers of Scorpio, and in some ways, Pluto has come in to take over or to help Mars manage Scorpio, if you will, because in ancient astrology, Mars was the planet of Scorpio. There's a real intensity here. This isn't just listening to Tchaikovsky's, overture to, 1812 overture, because when you have Pluto involved with Mars, whatever the energy or the aggression or the hostility or the anger that's stirred up doesn't necessarily go away quickly.
Yeah, and I've been, the news is really interesting. Getting a job isn't that easy for lots of people. The cost of living's going up. In other words, the economy is still struggling. And yet Wall Street has hit a record high. Now, from a South Node in Taurus point of view, that's good. Let's let the fat get fatter, and that will help us all. And yet, from a Scorpionic point of view, what's going on here? Why is it that the value of the companies by which we, in some ways, measure our collective well-being is going up, while more and more people are struggling on a day-to-day basis. And these kinds of dramatic patterns that are coming up suggest that we're more likely to ask questions about what's equitable or what can we do to take things in a new direction. And as many of us know, economic pressures create pressures in individual lives and in relationships. And boy, relationship with Venus in the middle of this story, I think, is up for reconfiguration.
Yeah, I do too. And it's, again, Venus is anything of value. And what's of value is love and money. And so we come back to the economic piece of this also. You know, it's certainly, the relationship axis is the Aries, I, me, mine, Libra, theirs, yours. And so the Libra full moon is often relationship oriented. With Venus involved, it's even more relationship oriented. And yet with that Pluto square, it's not only power in relationships or power struggle in relationships, and it can be love relationships, but it can also be economic relationships. It can be the relationships of the 99% to the 1% fat cat.
Yeah, and I think with all of this stuff in Aries, it's okay to have inequity if the means for innovation in individual lives is present. This is what all this Aries stuff wants. Aries doesn't want dependency. Aries doesn't want an equal distribution of income. Aries is not about fairness. Aries is about the freedom to take action, and we've got a very powerful and creative expression of that freedom here. And I think if we saw what we see in the large scale of capitalism on Wall Street, if there was a corollary on the smaller, on the individual level, if that was cooking, that would be fine. Then it wouldn't be a question of, is it entrepreneurship or collectivism? No, it might be a freer expression of individuality that would really encourage and allow and facilitate the process for those who have creative ideas to really make changes in their lives.
And I think you used the innovation word. Aries isn't so much about innovation. It's about anything new. New certainly can be innovative. And yet what happens the day after that full moon is the Sun and Venus together line up with Aries, the planet of innovation. So
you mean Uranus?
I'm sorry, line up with Uranus in Aries, Uranus, the planet of innovation. So we really go out this month, you know, in like a lamb, out like a lion, I think, March this year.
All right. Well, thank you, Rick. Thank you, Soul Food. Thank you, Julie, our wonderful videographer. Thank you all. If you'd like us to look at your charts, put your first name, your time, date, and place of birth on a piece of paper on the table over there, and we'll rejoin you in about 15 minutes to look at some individual charts.
And remember that Jeff and I do this as a community event. Soul Food creates this space for you as a community space. And the way in which you can vote, you know, yes on either this event or on Soul Foods being here is by supporting them by either, you know, economic voting, by buying things, or by getting more fluids to drink. We'll see you in about 15 minutes. Thank you all for showing up. Woo! Hey, Craig, do we have any books here? And we should mention that Jeff and I have written for 8 years now an annual Your Astrology Guide, published by Sterling Press, a division of Barnes & Noble. Not allowed to say that here in this bookstore. By Sterling Press, sorry. And they are available here, and it's just another way of saying thank you to Soul Food and thank you to Rick and Jeff. We'd be glad to sign your book if you get one while you're here tonight, or while we're here tonight. Thank you all. Ellen, her YouTube trailer. It's got 17,000 hits in 2 days. Yeah.
But it was, if I had to fight that every month, I wouldn't want to do it. Yeah, just put them on over there. Oh yeah, Rick, it was that's one reason I wanted to stop at the beginning is because it was just too I had this similar
Oh yeah.
noise.
It was terrible.
If it was like this every month, I wouldn't want to do it.
I got it.
But I
know.
get that you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I went in and out of that space several times during the evening, and
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I did, but I think in some levels it forced us to be more forceful because to basically overcome the.
Yeah, it took a while for me to find traction though. Oh well. But I mean, in a writer, we don't exclude other activities on the premises. So your daughter's stuck on the side of the road?
Yeah. Well, I couldn't come back.
So she can't. Oh gosh, poor kid. So you're gonna go rescue her? Well, thank you for hanging in there. You're a trooper, Julie. Yeah, you were thinking an hour somebody would be by.
It's right up there. Hey Julie, thank you. Did something happen with Ashley or something? No, don't do that. Don't do that.
I mean, it'll make you the big kahuna in prison.
Otherwise we'll just have to get someone else for next month.
Yeah, that's how much we care.
On a piece of paper and put it down.
Too late.
Oh, is it too late? He's already picked them. It has to be next month. Sorry.
Good luck out there, Julie.
Roger took. Yeah, she put a comment on it that said, Roger Sprague is an awesome photographer. This is a good picture on my page. I deleted it. Just because I don't have to look at it.
I get it. I understand. Although at the moment I'm in a forgiving mood. But it's not my story, so it's not.
Yeah. I can forgive and still delete it.
Absolutely. Just don't spell Don, John. Are you Don with an H or not? An umlaut? Are you,
Like Bjorn again.
Bjorn. He's wishing you even more than I wished you. You guys are awesome. Thanks.
Because I spelled wishes.
Fishes, like ice.
Fishes,
Well,
that's
I
right.
wanted to put the H. You said H and Don.
I
So I
say-
went W-H.
We are about ready to take a look at 3 charts. These are real people's real natal charts, also called a birth chart, also called a horoscope. And as Rick often points out, we do this not as counseling. Certainly in a public setting it wouldn't be appropriate. It's just a demonstration to the group about how astrology works on an individual level. So we're just going to take a couple of minutes to look at each one of the 3 charts that we put in.
We'll get there.
Here we go.
Whoops, for some reason.
So do we have Susan, born October 1st? Hi, Susan.
Susan.
You're a possible winner. We'll see. That's to be decided after. Wow, there's a lot of Libra here.
A lot of Libra.
Saturn, the Sun, the Moon, and Neptune. 4 planets in Libra, the sign of graciousness, among other things. But what strikes me, and there are always lots of things to talk about in a chart, are the strong contrasts between the Sun and the Moon in Libra here. Because the Sun in lovely Libra is joined with Saturn, the planet of responsibility, restraint, perhaps guilt, occasionally, which I consider to be inappropriate responsibility. So you think, oh, she's a Sun-Saturn conjunction. She's tougher than your basic Libra. But then Neptune, which is sort of the antithesis of hard-nosed Saturn, Neptune is soft, is next to the Moon. So there's like some real toughness as well as some real tenderness in this chart in a very striking way.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that Libra, as a as an air sign, often has it has those opposites. And Libra, unlike Gemini, where there's noise, in Libra they're allegedly in harmony or in balance, but it's the awareness that comes from pulling these 2 energies, from pulling the Saturnian Sun and the Neptunian Moon in opposite directions, and in between is reality.
Right.
Now, what's also interesting here, though, is that the Sun, which is certainly closer to Saturn, is also of the pack closest to the opposition to Jupiter. And here again, we have this. There's several things in this chart that again and again and again say an opposite or conflict of opportunities or choices. And here we have Jupiter in Aries that says, go for it now, do what's good for you, and just take the opportunity and run. And then we have Saturn in Libra saying, yes, but what's my responsibility to the relationship?
Yeah, I did a chart yesterday for a young man who had a Jupiter-Saturn opposition, the planets of expansion and contraction. And it's managing and it's learning how to shift gears between the optimistic, expansive, more and more of Jupiter to the contain it, constrain it, control it of Saturn. And of course, when it all becomes unbearable, Susan can just split. She's got Uranus, the planet of breakthrough, freedom, rebellion, or runaway, at a right angle or square to the moon and to the sun. You know, without going too deeply into this, this certainly represents to me the chart of someone who had to become self-reliant because the environment was crazy or the environment was not grounded. The moon is often the primary condition of early childhood. Not always, but often. And the moon is conjoined Neptune. Where are we? Who's drinking? Have another cocktail? Or and square or 90 degrees away from Uranus. What's coming? What's going? So that's a very dynamic and unsettled pattern. Now, it doesn't mean it's unhealthy, and every chart is perfect. Susan's chart is everything she needs, but it is about sort of an unusual growing up pattern that I think on some level the Saturn sun says, well, let me gain control of what I can because the rest of this stuff could just go anywhere at any time.
Well, and it's interesting, Jeff, how much our attention separately and together went to the same things, and yet there's, I think, other planets that would just tend to get overlooked, maybe even by Susan, and that is the Venus and Mercury in Virgo, which are kind of relatively quiet and stuffed out of the picture and not aspected and not contained in this very, powerful other, T-square when you have points on 3 of 4 corners of a square, with Jupiter on one corner, Uranus on another, and all these planets in Libra on another. And then we have Mercury here and Venus and the South Node, Venus fairly close to the South Node. And there's, I think, a great attention to the analytical process and to making use of what you know. But it somehow isn't apparent. It's not as obvious.
Yeah, I think the analytical process, which Rick is talking about, is relevant to Virgo, the sign of analysis. So the fact that the moon's south node, or path of least resistance in my lingo, is in Virgo can mean that it's like living on thin ice, and therefore you can't make any mistakes. And yet, I would certainly encourage Susan with the North Node, a point of integration in universal Pisces, that when she feels cornered between two choices, to consider, to open up to something that wasn't even on the menu. Because Pisces is imaginative, and Pisces is not going to be bound by the set of rules of Saturn conjoined the sun or the systems of all of these planets in Virgo. In other words, I don't think you can be perfect enough in a concrete material way to satisfy things. It's like do the best you can and then make it up.
Yeah, and I think that from a standpoint of timing, I mean, this chart is on fire in a number of different ways. We have Neptune opposing Venus, Neptune in Pisces opposite the Venus in Virgo, which certainly can set up idealism in relationships. And they can either be romantic or friendship or business relationships, relationships of any sort. And on top of that, we have Uranus and Pluto both playing rather large here.
Right. So this is a transformational time. And again, I think the greatest opportunities for fulfillment and success come from creativity and broadening the range of what's possible rather than trying to nail things down in a very limited way. Thank you, Susan.
Yay, Susan. Malia?
Is Malia here?
Malia. Malia.
I see a hand up. That is allegedly Malia. who, with a Moon Uranus conjunction in Sagittarius, is far away at the moment. The Moon is emotion and feeling. It's in Sagittarius, the sign of long distance travel, joined with Uranus, the planet of uniqueness we've talked about. And so interesting. I know. Go ahead. Let me see.
Well, I mean, it's on the descendant and conjuncting the nodal axis, and it's really interesting here because in some ways this is about freedom in relationships, and yet there's the dilemma here is when to be free and when to engage, I think.
Right. Because Uranus, the planet of freedom, joined with the Moon, certainly suggests an interior sense, a little bit like Susan, who had Uranus square the Moon, that life could change at an instant. And that can be, in a negative sense, chaotic and uncertain. In a positive sense, exciting and creative. But the contrast here is stark with Mars, the planet of action and no-nonsense Scorpio, joined with even less nonsensical Saturn in Scorpio. That's hardworking, nose to the grindstone energy. Mars and Saturn are workers, and when they're joined together, and particularly in a tough sign like Scorpio, that indicates the capacity to like really endure a lot to get things done.
Well, yeah, and I mean, we've talked a lot this evening about Pisces, and Malia is a Pisces, and yet her Pisces sun is harmonized with powerful Pluto, which in some ways gives you the stamina and the staying power, if you will, to really work through whatever the situations are. And yet, you know, my interpretation of that Mars-Saturn conjunction in Scorpio, there's a toughness to it, and yet there's also a bit of frustration, I think, involved. Again, I think it's tied to this dilemma of when to stay and when to go.
Yeah.
You know, what events, what do you focus on and follow through on, and what do you cut loose on and say, I'm done?
Yeah, and it's almost as if there's a lot of imagination. Sun in Pisces, certainly a Moon in Sagittarius has that potential.
Harmonized with Jupiter and Neptune.
Yeah, and Venus, the planet of love, in freedom-oriented Aquarius, Mercury in Aquarius, but Venus and Mercury in different ways form squares with these planets in Scorpio, which suggests, again, the contrast between what you can imagine, which is considerable and quite open and potentially very idealistic, versus what you can get done, what you can accomplish. And yet, I think this chart is really a good chart. It's like if you know, you were born in Oahu, if the island blew up, you would be one of the survivors. And I think that's Pluto trying the sun. That's the rapidity of the Moon Uranus. You're exceptional. And what happens to other people doesn't necessarily happen to you or affect you in the same way.
And I think from a standpoint of timing, there's two things that stand out. One of them is that Neptune, the planet of dreams and imagination and sometimes confusion, is coming into opposing your sun. This was, you know, kind of already in range, but will be with you throughout this year and even into early next year. And again, I think this is relationship oriented. It's oriented, I think, also towards what is your role at home versus your role in the outer world. You were born near noon, which is a sun high in the sky, is often someone who has ambition and wants to go somewhere in the realm of status, career, community, business, whatever. And yet with Neptune opposing that from the bottom of the chart, there is a bit of, you know, uncertainty with that. You know, and I think that this certainly can, you know, kind of create some tension between, you know, home and family and what's out there in the world.
Yeah, and I think a big issue is the partners you choose. And understanding, you know, I think it's really okay for you to exploit other people. And I don't mean rip them off. I mean to go for what you need The reasons are there's mobility in the relationship house with Uranus there, which suggests that they'll abandon you. And really taking back the projection of Uranus in the seventh is, no, you get to have unusual relationships that allow you the freedom, more freedom to come and go as you please. And rather than you handling Mars, Saturn all by yourself all the time, I'm the one who's hanging on and trying to make things work out, even though I'm ready to scream and run away. I think it's really interesting to know what you want, to take some of that kindly and graciously, but not necessarily feel you have to be committed to everything with a person with whom you get involved personally or professionally.
And I said earlier that there were two things of importance. There are actually three. 2 and 3 are Jupiter and Saturn. Jupiter is going over your ascendant, and this is often a time of personal growth. It's a time when opportunities can come to you, and yet at the same time we're coming into a Saturn return. Saturn is already in Scorpio in the sky. It's recently, last fall, early winter, lined up with Pluto. It's trining your sun. There's this sense of integrating that which is real, and yet this is all, in a way, I think, the pregame to what happens over the next year or so as you have the Saturn return. Saturn comes back to where it was when you were born, and you pick the directions. It looks like you've already picked some of those directions, but I think it's part of a wider sweep of what is your role going to be in your life in the next, in the next decades to come.
Yeah, it's really coming in a big way. Saturn return is part of that, and Neptune passing over the sun in your 10th house of career is, I think, a good consolidation of this chart, which is dream big and work hard, and you can actually have some amazing things happen.
Yeah, I actually said Neptune opposing the sun earlier. Thanks for,
right.
yeah, it's actually conjuncting it. And, it's not a big deal. It happens once every 165 years.
Yeah. So if you don't get it this time, you'll catch it next time around.
But there's also a deepening spirituality that can happen. This can be very creative. It can be confusing because there can be a sense of loss of direction. And on the other hand, it also can be incredibly creative if you allow yourself to go with the imagination.
Okay. Thank you, Malia. We appreciate it. All right. One more cup of coffee for the road. Please enroll your fingers. Or Rick's fingers. Diane? Diane. Yeah. All right. Well, contrast. For example, the moon of emotion and feeling is in Cancer, which in theory and principle is security conscious. Yet the moon is next to Jupiter, saying, I want more. It needs to be more. Then we have Venus and Mars, the lovers, the artistic pair, together in enthusiastic Sagittarius. I'll try one of those, but you don't know what it is. Well, I'll know what it is after I try it and after I do it. And yet Saturn, the planet of hard, cold reality, makes squares to this very enthusiastic and playful and exploratory pair. So, it's this to me is a chart that's a kind of adventurous chart. Actually, there's some real elements of adventure in it, but you should wear a helmet at all times because you never know what's going to happen.
Well, it's almost like it's emotional adventure. I mean, we're talking Jupiter and the moon, and Jupiter and the moon on the ascendant, even though they're in the 12th house. They're rising. It's Cancer rising. There's the sense of how big your feelings are, even though you may not express them. You keep them internal, perhaps, even though they have to leak out, and they leak out in excitement, in romance, in creativity. It's a very creative chart with the with Venus and Mars together in the 5th house, the house of creativity, the house of play. And yet, as Jeff said, squared Saturn, it's like you're always ready to play, but Dad's there kind of making sure that you put your toys away and that you don't make a mess when you're painting. And, so there's this whole piece of kind of not letting yourself go too far, kind of always watching yourself or kind of pulling in. And also the level of emotional depth, the Mercury in Scorpio harmonized or trining with the Jupiter Moon ascendant. I mean, I think you're very comfortable in the world of emotions, but sometimes getting them out is a bit tricky.
Yeah, this is good for play therapy kind of thing. The Venus-Mars conjunction in Sagittarius, which is very playful, but as Rick pointed out, the emotional richness of not just that moon in Cancer joined Jupiter, but that trine to Mercury in Scorpio really gives a depth of perception and an understanding of what feelings are about. Yet, at the very, or should I say, and look how close Uranus and Pluto are.
Yeah, I was just thinking that was the elephant, on the table.
That's the earthquake in the room, So it's almost like this is a chart that can declench or open up extraordinary energy in yourself, in the world around you. In other words, you could be that person who sort of walks through the mall and then things are crashing behind you that seem to have absolutely nothing to do with you. No, because there's a kind of constrained kinetic force here. This kinetic force comes up, I think, with Uranus-Pluto,
which is what created, from an astrological point of view, the intensity and the craziness and the revolutionary bacchanalian wonder of the 60s. That happened in the summer of 1965 and 66, and you have this once every century and a third alignment or conjunction of Uranus and Pluto, which are the two planets that are now squaring, which is kind of putting us all back through those spaces. I sometimes say that there are people who were born before the 60s who lived through the 60s, and then there were people who were born with the Uranus-Pluto conjunction, and the 60s lived through the Pluto conjunction, and the 60s lived through them. Now, it doesn't mean that you look like that on the outside, but there's that sense of that explosive, intense, transformative, evolutionary energy is part of who you are, and yet with that Cancer rising, you go through life with an invisibility cloak on. People just don't know. They see you, but they don't. You walk by, like Jeff says, the earthquakes happen behind you, and they don't even notice that. It's like, who was that masked man? They don't know who came through just a few moments ago, and so I think you can take more responsibility, for that kind of stuff than perhaps you have.
Yeah, and another interesting piece is the sun is relatively disconnected. The sun of will and purpose is in Libra, but look, it has one thin blue line in terms of aspects, which for Libra, it kind of makes you a Switzerland. Now, here's the Red Cross over here. That's the Red Cross over there. And
taking care of everyone.
And there's rich people skiing over here. And you're just, going through.
Yeah, there was one other thing that came into my mind as you were talking, and it's gone in one ear and out my brother's. I know what it was. It was from a timing standpoint, from a timing sense, from a timing aspect, the fact that over the past several years, Pluto, which moved into Capricorn in 2005.
I forget. I'm in total denial.
2007.
I don't know. I don't
So
want to
in the
know.
past 3 or 4 years, Pluto has come opposite your Jupiter and your moon, and is still yet to come opposite your ascendant, Pluto here now in the sky in Capricorn. And Uranus, going back just 2 years ago, March, April, May, in that period of time, Uranus in Aries was 90 degrees to your moon, and so there's this sense of the explosiveness, and it's almost like the last 4 or 5 years you've been on a one-way street. There's no going back to who you were 6 or 7 or 8 years ago. It's all changed. It's still changing. It's still in flux because Uranus and Pluto have not yet hit the ascendant point, and it'll take a few years until they actually also hit the sun. So it's still, you're in process, but it's an intense process. And the life quakes that Jeff was talking about earlier, life quakes, earthquakes, whatever, really probably have already happened going back, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago, in a process of total meltdown, total explosion, and then a beginning of a reconstruction. Yeah? Yeah. That was an emphatic
All right.
yeah.
Thank you, Diane. Thanks again, Rick. Thank
Thanks,
you,
Jeff.
Soul Food, Craig, Lily. And thank you for coming out on an unusually rainy night.
And the bar is still open, so buy yourself some drinks before. Thank you all.